First of all, I would like to greet the participants of the American Weil Society Symposium. I thank the organizing committee, Anne Astel, Jane Doering, and Sophie Bourgault, your president, of their invitation to present a lecture. Reasons beyond my control, which Simone Weil calls the hard necessity, did not allow me to make the trip to the USA. Marie-Noël and I regret not finding you, American friends, because we would have liked to exchange with you. I beg you to be lenient for my pronunciation of English, which is not very good. In the reading of my text, if the reading of my text is nevertheless understandable, it is thanks to the help of Jane, translator, and who has been my coach. My lecture is entitled "The Responsibility of Writers: The True Relationship of Good and Evil." Simone Weil's position on the responsibility of literature is not that of a reactionary ideologue who lament the decline of morals in the arts. It is necessary to distinguish two goods of the same denomination, but radically different. One that is the opposite of evil and one that is absolute. The absolute has not opposite. In other words, what is directly contrary to an evil is perhaps never of the order of a higher good, but only a good in the penal code. The diminishing of the notion of value is serious in a different way than the waning of the social values that belong to the middle region, that of the law, for example. The notion of value is indeed always present in the mind of all persons who cannot do otherwise than orient their thoughts and actions toward some good. The pure values of truth, duty, and good have by one and the same act a particular application of the plenitude of attention to the object, a good orientation of spirit. Such is the human condition, a word of admirable ambiguity, affirmed Simone Weil in one of her first philosophical writings. Far from being able to escape it, the artist is the first to be obliged to be interested in it. It is the entire problem of the responsibility of the writers in their specific activity. First part, literature and awakening to the truth. Every activity has a twofold relationship to good and to evil in its execution and in its principle. The first criterion is stylistic, from the point of view according to whether a book is well or poorly composed. According to the second, a book could proceed either from good or from evil. We must add a third criterion, the most important. Literature of the highest order is an expression of truth. Good literature cannot be made with either good or with evil, but by expressing the true relationship between good and evil. Writers do not have to be teachers of morals, says he. One asks them to awaken us to the truth of the human condition. A writer's mission is to translate any human experience into words that render it intelligible to those who have not been through it. That has nothing to do with the psychology that infuses the literature of the 20th century, and which consists in describing the states of the soul by spreading them out on the same level, without any discrimination as to their value, as if good and evil were external to them. Consequently, the moral responsibility of the writer differs from a simple promotion of good as the contrary of evil. A higher expression of the conformity of the true relationship between good and evil is appropriate to give the maturity of genius insofar as it is oriented toward the good. Can one thus ignore that geniuses do exist who are not oriented in this way? Simone Weil recognizes there are also demonic geniuses, and they also have their maturity. However, the work that corresponds to the maturity of a demonic genius is silence. Rimbaud is the example and symbol of it. The maturity of the demonic genius lacks the execution that would allow a truthful expression of the relation of good and evil, because it lacks the relation to good and evil in its principle. Hence, the privileged example of Rimbaud. It is not true that he is a continuation of Villon, because the sense of good and evil does not infuse in his verse. With Rimbaud, good and evil are not situated according to their true relationship. That's why the maturity of the demonic genius can only lead him to silence, the silence from below. And Simone Weil quotes Rimbaud, "I no longer know how to speak." A first-rate demonic genius is an impossibility. He can only remain an immature genius. The reproach of immorality addressed to writers points in the wrong direction. It doesn't aspire to the right level. One imagines that this immorality is an intentional opposition to the rules of morality, those of the good defined as the opposite of evil. In reality, since literature is above all made up of fiction, immorality is inseparable from it, and one is wrong to reproach writers for being immoral unless one also reproaches them at the same time for being writers. As for those who claim a high morality, they are in no way less immoral than the others, but simply worse writers. To look for a remedy to immorality is therefore a completely vain undertaking. Genius is the only remedy, and its source is not within reach of our effort. All that a writer can do is to orient his attention toward the truth, toward the good, by creating the conditions for the eventual descent of genius into him. His sole reason for being is to constitute a milieu where such genius will one day appear. It is in terms of waiting hypomone, that Simone Weil expresses herself, as it were a question of receiving of grace. One can no more make an effort to find genius than to make an effort to seek God. Unknown source of inspiration is that good toward which the suppliant desire is turned. The gaze of the soul is directed with expectation, desire, and supplication toward one of the sources of inspiration above the heavens of below, or above the heavens or below. According to whether the desire is oriented towards one domain or toward the other, the inspiration is religious or idolatrous. The case could be one of moralizing oriented toward good below the heavens. It is a question, therefore, of avoiding moral fantasy as well as immorality, for there is something even more foreign to good and evil than immorality, and it is a certain morality of idolatrous inspiration, much worse than the state of being it claims to remedy. Reality possesses the power to awaken us to the truth, which defines genius, when reality hits us hard enough and pulls us for only an instant from the half-sleep of life, peopled with our fictions and our dreams. This is the case, for example, when in contact with an elevated being, a saint, or with a fall into the milieu of affliction or of crime. Genius, having reached the plenitude of maturity, has the capacity to awaken us, although its works are made with words. Isn't there, however, in reality, a necessity, an impossibility that is absent in fiction, just as gravity is absent on the canvas of painting? What precisely defines a genius or the first order, there are not very many, said Weil, is the capacity to go beyond fiction, but from within fiction, to confer reality where it is absent in fiction of the second and third order and in life itself. Genius of the first order can even render perceptible the contact with a supernatural reality that suspends the effect of earthly necessity. In Kant, genius doesn't apply rules, it gives its rule to the creation. According to Simone Weil, genius creates a reality, rendering it discernible, present, and manifest. Such a genius can only be oriented toward the good, as can be seen in certain comedies of Molière and in the poetry of Villon, where good and evil appear in their truth. Only the orientation toward the good makes possible the expression of the true relationship of good and evil. That is explained by the fact that between good and evil considered as contraries, the true good is above the conflict and yet takes side, supreme mystery. The paradox of good above the conflict between good and evil, but which nevertheless takes side, is insoluble in the framework of the incomplete reality, which is the world here below. Only the introduction of an additional dimension allows a resolution of paradoxes. The inseparable immorality of literature and the moralism of bad writers are not reasons to condemn literature or to condemn literature in block. There is indeed a way out, to pass over in some way by dint of art to the side of reality, which genius alone is able to do. In other words, it is a question of going from the interior of art to reality. Works of the very first order are outside fiction and take us out of it and give us, under the form of fiction, something equivalent to the very thickness of reality that life presents to us every day, but that we do not know how to seize. Literature brings much less, while with the life of which the substance is made almost uniquely of fiction, of what we tell ourselves, our past, our future, what other things and do. In any case, if reality furnishes some elements, we surround them with a fog in which values are reversed, as in all fiction. Genius of the first order is defined, consequently, by the power to dissipate this fog. Christina Vogel expresses it excellently when she writes that authentic geniuses go beyond without living in the universe of fiction by modifying in it such a fashion that a dimension freed from ordinary fantasizing opens up, allowing the light of truth enter. Literature of the first order reaches the highest degree of fiction, becoming a sort of beyond fiction. Certainly, in life, when reality hits us hard enough, we briefly feel the horrible monotony of evil and the unfathomable marvel of good. But soon we fall back into the half-sleep populated with our chattering. Simone Weil lived the shock of real life through the fall into affliction when she worked in the factory. She noted that her fellow workers complained almost always falsely, that humiliation created forbidden zones of thought, covered over by either silence or lie. While this is felt by the one who collides with reality, it is true that a man of talent is able, through exercising his imagination, to perceive and describe it to a certain extent from the exterior. Jules Romain, for example, devoted a chapter to factory life in Les Hommes de bonne volonté, men of good will. This is the writer's task, concedes Simone Weil, but that doesn't go very far. She reproaches Jules Romain for not describing the true relationship of good and evil in the factory. There is affliction in the factory, but also a poetry, that of the powerful sentiment of collective life, that of a great respiration of work in common, a feeling so much more intoxicating to share that the sentiment of solitude is not altered. To express the true relationship of good and evil in the factory is to render perceptible at the paradoxical reality of a place of exile where simultaneously on feels indispensable to the impelling rhythm of a universe. What makes first-rate works superior in the expression of such a complex truth is that in the world assembled by a genius, several slopes are simultaneously visible and intuited, situated according to their true relationship, but the listener or reader doesn't descend any one of them. If there is an imbalance, one can write almost a great book, but in truth, a small book, as Mauriac did with Thérèse d'Esquerre. Quote, the portrait of evil is missing, and the spot of an illusion with the good, he created confusion. He didn't make the distance as well as the resemblance apparent. Unquote. On the contrary, in the Iliad, the slope of victory and that of defeat are manifest and are simultaneously sensed. The poet does not adopt a perspective, doesn't situate himself from the psychological point of view that accepts to each his own truth. He expresses the true relation between the gravity that governs souls and other motivating force. Who, if not the poet of genius, would be able to render discernible the extraordinary equity that inspires the Iliad? An equity apparently paradoxical, which appears in orthodox works to be contrary to common justice, that the best win, that virtue triumphs, and that only the defeated are victims of force, because it uncompromisingly expresses a truth that has always had unequal side. Second part. The truth of exposed things in Venice say. In her own literary creation, Simone Weil strives to manifest a truth that is in the task of the poet to present. Venice Saved exposes the tension between the reign of necessity and an unquenchable aspiration to the good, for the supernatural, and for the love. By referring to the character of Chenavier, she expresses the paradox of what she calls truth in literature. It is necessary to succeed in giving for a moment the feeling that it is the good that is abnormal. And indeed, it is so in the world. And irrevocable ambivalence reigns on the eventual spared city of Venice. Indeed, Chenavier, saver of the city, is a traitor to his friends. He remains a sublime, innocent soul, and at the same time, he is guilty. He is a redeemer cursed by those he has snatched from death. Pure good doesn't triumph in this world by suppressing evil. It is another subtle mechanism that must be shown. I quote, Chenavier, passion. One of the meanings of passion is perhaps that the pain, the shame, the death, that one does not want to inflict on others fall back on oneself, without wishing it to be so, as if mathematical fiction were obliged to compensate for the prevented crime, so that the soul remains subject to evil, but subject in a different way, unquote. There is a conversion, the evil that would engender suffering in other is turned back on the self, attracted by the self in order to protect them. Simone Weil is very precise. She writes, as if mathematically. It is a simple analogy. The affliction drawn upon oneself does not really compensate for the evil in moral terms, because compensation for damages makes sense in the realm of law, but not in that of morality. Moralism doesn't get its account, but truth does, since that is the way it is in the world. One is not aware of it. Art must bring it to the consciousness. And given awareness that good is abnormal but possible, whereas evil is in the logic of things. Art has the task of rendering perceptible the transfer of energy between evil committed and evil suffered. No evil evaporates in the world, but only becomes distributed differently. One's only obligation is to consent to this redistribution when it is inevitable, to accept whatever is strictly impossible for me to prevent. One must want it as belonging to the given Weil, because decidedly the force of gravity is in this world, has been willed by God from the creation. Art has the task of presenting characters who reveal that affliction is a marvel of the divine technique, in order to show that it is possible to the one who is annihilated by brutal force, continue to want to love. As Gustav Herling Grozinski has shown, Chenavier is caught between two reasons of state, that of Renaud, who threatens Venice with destruction, and that of the Council of Ten, who refused to grant pardon to the conspirators in exchange for the life that Chenavier offers them. The conflict between the two reasons of state must, with the same necessity proper to this world, pulverize the absolute pietas, pity. But now, the reality of Chenavier doesn't coincide with that of the conspirators close to victory, nor with that of Venice saved. It is a reality that infinitely exceeds both of them, which renders his victory precarious and his defeat inevitable. How could a just retribution coincide with his desire to have wanted to save the city and at the same time to save the enemies of the city who were motivated by the project of destroying it? That would be in contradiction with the forces and the laws in this world. It is the strength of a first-rate genius in its maturity to show that consent to the necessity that governs the balance of forces in this world bears fruit on another plane, another level than the one here below. It is for Chenavier to perceive reality in the perfect detachment that alone permits seeing things naked without the fog of false value, which are, for example, the desire for power and the reasons of. Simone Weil adds in parentheses, may the play Venice saved reproduce this moment. Indeed, Chenaviers' moment of meditation at the end of the second act is the moment when reality enters into him because he gave his attention and he realizes that Venice exists. Simone Weil notes again in her notebooks, make Chenaviers' retreat feel supernatural. And it is there that eternity enters time. The tension of the supernatural and the immobility protects from the influence of the imagination of gravity. It is the third dimension in the order of human destiny, which art must present. Only art can make perceptible an equivalent of a truth that opens to a reality that is not of this world. Conclusion. By intervening on the question of the responsibility of writers, Simone Weil confesses that she cannot prevent herself from defending a certain manner of seeing contrary to that of almost all those who are sympathetic to her, and from having a similar appearance by misfortune to those for whom she feels no sympathy. In appearance, indeed, for that interpretation would only have a reason to be if Simone Weil's position was that of a moralist joining those who, in the quarrel of bad teachers, accuse writers of being responsible for the decline of France and for its defeat in 1940. However, if Simone Weil asks what needs to be corrected in the literary field, this has nothing to do with the moral rectification dear to the Pétainist ideology. She specifies what can and must be corrected is the usurpation by the writers of the function of spiritual directors that doesn't suit them at all. As for the function of spiritual directions, observes Simone Weil, only those geniuses of the highest order in their full maturity are apt to exercise it. Even more radically, she writes, to tell the truth, only the greatest saints are capable of it. Among writers, the greatest geniuses. That the greatest writers might find a place among the greatest saints confers on them a very high responsibility. How must they exercise it? Spiritual direction is part of the art of governing men by the guidance of their souls. In the need for roots, it is a question of shaping souls. It is a question of shaping souls and of shaping the soul of the country. In any case, the procedures of such an art differ from that of a state, of a government, with an institutional form. Spiritual direction is turned toward individuals and assumes that they remain always in charge in their own conduct. Verbi, Simone Weil admits that the Church exercises spiritual authority by encouraging believers to seek spiritual direction. But she warns there must never be any element of social constraint. Now, what must be corrected in the usurpation by the writers of the function of spiritual direction is precisely the authority they exercise. This usurpation, specifies Simone Weil, does not appear as a constraint in the strict sense of the word, but it produces serious effects when its influence spreads over the people, especially over the course of this recent quarter of a century. Prior to that, the limited amount of bad literature that circulated among the people had its counterpoison in perfectly beautiful things that bathed popular life, religious ceremonies, songs, dances. But above all, such literature had not authority. The misfortune is that the authority linked to the function of spiritual direction, usurped by people of letters, has descended to the basis of publication. The most eminent of writers are involved in these publications, introducing the idea of continuity between them and the highest literary practice. Simone Weil considers that to have attributed the authority formally attached to the words of prayers to the most offensive of periodical is a crime for which all those who know how to handle a pen should be obliged to assume responsibility and repentance. In 1941, while noticing signs of weakening in the usurpation by writers of their function of spiritual direction, when Weil tempered their hopes, we would have to rejoice if there were not reason to fear that something much worse will replace it. Today, what would she say of a spiritual direction usurped by the most vile of publications and media that impose on us a daily reading of the word? The power to tell ourselves our own fictions has disappeared to the advantage of invented narration shaped by professionals before we have been able to initiate even the slightest dream or to elaborate the slightest imaginary element coming from ourselves. How can we not ask once again the question, quote, how can we, astonished to have fallen in this way to our present condition? I thank you very much.